Walt Gruber had been hunting that ridge for 31 years when the ship landed in the valley below it. He looked at it for about 4 seconds. He looked at the armored figures coming down the ramp. He looked at the formation marching up the slope toward his position. Then he looked at the gap in the armor at the base of the lead soldier's collar, the kind of gap that appears when a soldier turns slightly to address someone beside him. Walt had made harder shots than that in worse weather. He didn't think about it. He just did what 30 years of November mornings had trained his hands to do. The sound of the shot rolled out across the valley and answered the only question anyone on that ridge had been sitting with. These things could be hurt. The Verith Dominion had conquered 23 worlds in 260 years, not beaten them, not negotiated with them, conquered them cleanly, efficiently, and without what their fleet commanders would have called unnecessary prolonged engagement. The Verith had a method. They had refined it across 6 star systems and 4 centuries of careful expansion. Surveyed the target world from orbit, identified the sparsest defended regions, land fast and hard in those regions, demonstrate overwhelming force to the locals, accept surrender, move on. It worked every time. It had never once failed to work. Fleet Commander Drevek had personally overseen 5 planetary acquisitions using this method. He was, by any measure, the most accomplished field commander in the Verith Dominion's expansion division. His after-action reports were required reading at the Academy. His casualty rates across 5 campaigns were a point of institutional pride, so low that the numbers had been audited twice before anyone believed them. When his fleet's survey division finished their assessment of the 3rd planet of the Sol system, Drevok read the report with the mild, professional satisfaction of someone looking at a task that was going to be easy. Thin population density across large continental territories, minimal organized military presence outside of coastal and northern regions, interior landmass largely agricultural, detected weapons, signatures, civilian-grade and scattered. No centralized defensive infrastructure visible. One particular continental interior region drew his attention. A territory called Wyoming. High elevation. Low population. Almost entirely rural. The survey AI rated it as the lowest resistance probability of any region on the entire planet. Drevak initialed the landing coordinates. He had absolutely no way of knowing that the survey had been conducted during August, and that August in Wyoming was a very different thing from November in Wyoming, and that in November, half the population of a 3-county radius was already outside, already armed, and in the specific frame of mind that comes from waking up before sunrise for 2 weeks straight in temperatures that would make most species question their life choices. The Verith fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel on the 6th day of the month. They had, without any possible way of knowing it, picked the single worst week of the year to make first contact with this particular stretch of the planet. There are things that orbital scans cannot tell you. They can tell you population density. They can tell you infrastructure. They can measure weapons, signatures, and rate them against known threat categories. They can map roads and buildings and power grids with extraordinary precision. What they cannot tell you is what a place feels like in the 3rd week of hunting season. They cannot tell you about the specific culture of a region where self-reliance is not a philosophy. It is just Tuesday, where people learn to read wind direction before they learn to drive, where the ability to make a clean shot at 400 meters in a crosswind is considered a basic life skill rather than a military qualification, where every truck on every gravel road has at minimum 1 rifle behind the seat, a thermos that's been refilled 4 times before noon, and a driver who has been in worse situations than this and handled them. The Verith Survey Division noted, civilian weapon signatures, small caliber scattered, non-military. What they were actually looking at was 12,000 licensed hunters already in the field. Across 2.5 million acres of terrain they knew better than their own living rooms. The Survey Division noted, population density minimal, expected civilian response limited. What they were actually facing was a culture where the appropriate response to a problem on your land was to deal with it yourself first, and call someone official second, if at all, and even then mostly as a courtesy. The Survey Division noted, no significant organized military presence in the target zone. What they had entirely failed to account for was that organized military structure is only one of several ways a population can be dangerous. Another way is 2 weeks of pre-dawn mornings in 14-degree weather that filters out everyone who isn't serious, leaving only the people who genuinely want to be out here doing this, regardless of difficulty. Fleet Commander Drevak did not know any of this when he authorized the landing. He found out shortly that ships came down at 0600 local time on a Tuesday. There were 3 landing sites selected across the target region, spread to maximize coverage and minimize response time between them. The primary sites dropped into a shallow valley east of a small settlement called Granger's Creek, population 114 according to the survey, though that number was agricultural residents only and did not account for the 311 hunting licenses active within a 20-mile radius. Commander Drevek's ground element descended the ramp of the primary vessel into cold, still air and pale gray light. The ground was frozen solid. The grass was the color of old straw. The sky was the hard, flat blue that comes before the sun clears the mountains. It was, objectively, beautiful country. Drevak would have appreciated this more if he had been there for any reason other than conquest. His second-in-command, a soldier the Verith translation systems had rendered as Lieutenant Veth, completed his first sweep and turned to report. Scans show approaching metal signatures, multiple vectors, civilian vehicles. Hold position, Drevak said. We demonstrate force. They respond with submission. It proceeds as it always proceeds. The first truck arrived 7 minutes later. It pulled up on the ridge above the valley and stopped, and a man got out of it and looked down at the Verith landing site with the specific expression of someone who has found a problem on their property and is already working out what to do about it. He was wearing an orange vest. He had a rifle. He was followed, over the next 15 minutes, by 4 more trucks. Then 6 more. Then, as radio channels carried word across the surrounding terrain, more after that. None of them left. They're gathering, Veth observed. A surrender delegation, Drevak said. Standard response. Send the broadcast. The translation system boomed across the valley in the local language. People of this territory, you are now under Verith Dominion authority. Submit peacefully and no harm will come to you. There was a long pause from the ridge. Then a man's voice came back unhurried, flat, carrying the particular tone of someone who has not yet decided whether this situation deserves to be taken seriously. This is private grazing land. You're going to need to explain yourselves before this goes any further. Drevak stared at the translation. He had received many responses to this broadcast across his career. Panic, fear, immediate offers of negotiation, organized military challenges, once memorably complete silence followed by a mass evacuation attempt. He had never received a property rights inquiry. They are requesting identification, Veth said, carefully. We are the Verith Dominion, Drevak said. We do not provide identification to planetary primitives. He ordered the formation forward to demonstrate force. This was, looking back on it later, the decision that defined the rest of the day. The man on the ridge was named Walt Gruber. He was 54 years old, had been hunting this particular stretch of country since he was 12, and had served 8 years in the military before coming home to run the family ranch. He looked at the armored formation marching up the slope toward his position and said nothing for a moment. Then he said to the man standing next to him, "You see that joint in the armor at the base of the collar?" The man next to him, who was named Pete Allison and had taken 2 weeks off from his job at the propane supply company specifically for hunting season, said, "I see it. That's a design flaw," Walt said. Neither of them said anything after that for a moment. The formation reached the ridge, and the lead soldier raised a weapon that made a sound like the air was thinking about becoming something else. A voice from the armor crackled with translation. "Your weapons are incapable of penetrating Verith combat armor. Resistance will result," and Walt shot him in the collar joint. He didn't make a speech about it. He didn't announce it. He just did it, the way he had done things his entire life, carefully. After studying the problem, when he was confident the solution was correct, the sound of the shot rolled across the valley. For 3 seconds, nobody moved. Then every radio channel in 2 counties lit up simultaneously, because that single shot answered the only question that had been in the air since the ships landed. The question every person on every ridge and every truck and every makeshift position had been quietly sitting with: whether these things, whatever they were, with their armor and their ships and their overwhelming force, whether they could be hurt. Now they knew. What followed was not organized. There was no central command. There was no coordinated tactical plan. There was no military structure giving orders. There was just several hundred people who had spent the last 2 weeks reading terrain and wind and animal behavior, who knew this land the way they knew their own kitchens, responding to a threat to their home in the way that felt entirely natural to them. They spread out. They used cover. They shot at the gaps in the armor because Walt had found one, and word travels fast on shared radio channels. They used the ridge lines and draws and tree lines they had spent years hunting through. And those positions meant that Drevak's formation trained for engagement against organized military opposition on flat terrain, with clear sightlines, had absolutely no doctrine for what was happening to them. Lieutenant Veth's voice came through the command channel, strained in a way that suggested he was choosing his words carefully. "Commander, the civilian population is there extremely accurate, and they appear to be coordinating through their communication channels without any military structure whatsoever." "How is that possible?" Drevak said. "I believe," Veth said slowly, "that they don't need structure. They all appear to know what to do individually." Drevak watched the casualty feed update with a speed his career had not prepared him for. The formation that had crested that ridge 60 seconds ago, in perfect order, was now in retreat with losses that should not have been possible against civilian small arms. He ordered them back to the ship. They made it most of the way. The secondary landing site had dropped near a highway interchange and a cluster of grain storage facilities. This seemed, on the survey data, like a defensible position with good sight lines and minimal cover for opposing forces. It was also, as it happened, on the property of a man named Doyle Mercer, who ran 1,600 acres of wheat operation, who had a nephew currently deployed overseas, and who had spent 43 years operating heavy agricultural equipment in conditions that would challenge most military vehicles. When the Verith troopers at that site attempted to establish a perimeter and ordered approaching vehicles to halt, Doyle drove his grain truck through the perimeter at full load. He did not speed up dramatically. He did not shout or make any particular statement. He drove through at the same speed he always drove on that road, because it was his road. It connected his property to his grain storage, and he had no intention of stopping on it for anyone who hadn't been invited. He parked, climbed out, looked at the scattered troopers, and said, "You've got 10 minutes to move whatever that is before I need to make another run." The troopers, none of whose training had included protocols for a human being who appeared genuinely unbothered by the presence of armed extraterrestrials, did not immediately respond. By the time they reconfigured, there were 12 trucks on the road and 47 people who had shown up, not because anyone called them, but because things had been happening on the radio channels. And out here you showed up when your neighbor had a problem. The third site landed on open range near a long-established hunting camp. This seemed ideal. Flat, open ground, no buildings, no significant population within several miles. The hunting camp held 9 people who had been tracking a specific elk herd through that exact terrain for 8 consecutive days. These were people who could read a track in frozen ground and tell you how long ago it had been made and how fast the animal had been moving. People who had learned to sit perfectly still in temperatures that averaged 12 degrees. People who had, on multiple occasions, passed up shots that most marksmen would have taken because the angle wasn't exactly right. When Verith scouts moved out from that site to assess the terrain, they walked into the most patient, most precise, most completely invisible group of people they were ever going to encounter. The scouts did not come back. By 1400 hours, the Verith Dominion's 7th expansion fleet had suffered more casualties in a single morning than in any previous engagement in 260 years of recorded conquest. Not against organized military forces, not against advanced defensive technology, not against fortified positions or coordinated tactical doctrine, against hunters, against a retired game warden who organized radio communications with the calm efficiency of someone who had been waiting his entire career for something important enough to apply his skills to, against a sheriff with 2 combat tours who directed people not because he commanded them, but because he clearly knew what he was talking about and that was sufficient authority out here. Against Walt Gruber, who had found a flaw in Verith armor in approximately 45 seconds of observation and communicated it to 300 people over a shared radio channel before anyone on the Verith side realized what had happened. Against grain trucks, against tow chains, against 9 people in a hunting camp who had, collectively, made over 400 successful shots on moving targets at range in the previous 8 days and saw no reason to treat the current situation differently. Drevak sat in the command chair of his ship and looked at the casualty feed and understood something that no survey, however thorough, could have told him. Something that lived in the culture of a place rather than in its statistics. "Veth," he said. "Sir, the recommendation for this region. What do you want it to say?" Veth considered the question for a moment. "Permanent avoidance, sir, with detailed annotation. Write it up." The message to Orbital Command was the hardest report Drevak had written in his career. Not because the facts were difficult to state. Because the facts, once stated, were embarrassing in a way that 260 years of successful expansion had not prepared him for. Local population routinely armed. Civilian engagement capability exceeds standard military opposition in accuracy and terrain adaptation. Population demonstrates organized resistance response without centralized command structure. Engagement coincided with seasonal period during which local population is at maximum field presence and preparedness. He stopped, read it back, added one more line that was not required by any format but felt necessary. "We identified this region as low resistance based on population density. We were measuring the wrong thing. Population density does not account for what a population is doing when you arrive. We arrived during the 1 week of the year when this population was already outside, already armed, and already in the specific frame of mind that comes from 2 weeks of early mornings and cold weather and doing hard things because those things were worth doing. We mistook their patience for complacency. We mistook their independence for vulnerability. Both conclusions were incorrect. I do not believe any future commander should make them again." He sent the report. He ordered the evacuation of all ground forces from all 3 sites. And he watched, through the ship's external cameras, as the Verith Dominion's 7th expansion fleet left the 3rd planet of the Sol system without securing a single square meter of it. Life in Granger's Creek went back to normal the way small places always go back to normal, season following season, because normal was what they'd been defending in the first place. Walt Gruber went back out hunting 4 days later. He never did get an elk that year, though he saw a decent bull twice on the ridge above the valley where the ship had landed. He said later that something about the light on that ridge was different now. Not worse, just different. Doyle Mercer kept driving his grain truck. The dent from the perimeter impact he left there, it wasn't worth fixing, and besides, people kept asking about it, and the story was worth more than a straight panel. The sheriff got a phone call from a colonel thanking him for his exceptional crisis response. He thanked the colonel, hung up, told his wife, and made himself a cup of coffee so strong it could strip rust from steel, because some things don't change and that seemed like a good thing. The official record described the incident as an unidentified aerial phenomena event, contained by local authority response. Nobody in Granger's Creek paid much attention to the official record. They knew what had happened. They knew who had been standing where. And every November after that, when hunting season came back around and the wind came down off the mountains and the frost settled on the truck windshields and the orange vests came out of the closets, somebody at the bar would tell the story. It always ended the same way, with the same line: wrong state, wrong month, wrong week to test what Wyoming's made of. 18 months after the fleet's retreat, a Verith intelligence analyst named Sev filed a report that nobody in the expansion division wanted to read. She had spent the intervening time doing what Drevik's survey team had not done, actually studying the planet's culture rather than its geography, reading everything available, analyzing patterns. Her report ran 40 pages. The summary was 3 sentences. The region the fleet engaged is not exceptional. It is representative. This civilization has 273 million registered personal weapons in circulation among a population trained in their use from childhood. The Verith Dominion's surveys identified this as negligible threat based on the weapon's caliber and civilian classification. We were grading on the wrong scale. The correct metric is not weapon type. The correct metric is the number of individuals who know how to use them, under pressure, in difficult terrain, without being told what to do. By that metric, Commander Drevak did not encounter a low resistance region of a primitive planet. He encountered a random sample of the most heavily armed civilian population in the documented galaxy, and they were having a bad week before he arrived. Recommendation: do not return. The report was reviewed. It was debated. It was eventually classified and filed, and somewhere in a Verith military database. The third planet of the Sol system received a notation that would be studied by analysts for generations. High risk, engagement not advised. Civilian population demonstrates combat effectiveness without military structure, motivation without command hierarchy, an adaptive response capability that exceeds predictive modeling. Note: threat level appears consistent across continental interior, not regional anomaly. Note: planet's autumn season is particularly inadvisable. And for the first time in 260 years of expansion, the Verith Dominion left a planet on the survey map, rich in resources, well within reach, and simply decided it wasn't worth it. Not because the planet was defended by armies, not because it had weapons that could reach their ships, but because somewhere in a valley in Wyoming, a man in an orange vest had looked at a problem on his property, found a solution, and communicated it to 300 people over a hunting channel before breakfast. And the galaxy understood, finally, what it had been looking at all along. Not a primitive world, not a low resistance target, not an easy acquisition, a planet full of people who had been getting up before sunrise, in the cold, doing hard things for reasons that had nothing to do with anyone telling them to for so long that it had simply become who they were. You couldn't survey that from orbit. You could only find out the hard way. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that the most dangerous thing in the galaxy might just be someone who woke up at 4 in the morning because they wanted to subscribe. There are more human stories from the stars. And in every one of them, someone underestimated us first.